My name is Isabel Wheeler, and I'm 29 years old. The ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel was packed with 200 people. My father had spent 38 years accumulating colleagues from the firm, old clients, distant relatives who only showed up for events with an open bar, and every single one of them was clapping as my father, Gerald Wheeler, stood at the head table in his charcoal suit, tapping a fork against his champagne glass. This was his retirement dinner, the culmination of a career spent building Wheeler and Associates from a two-room office into one of the most respected accounting firms in the state, and I had flown in from 3 states away just to be here, just to watch him have this moment, because despite everything, despite the years of feeling like an afterthought in my own family, I still wanted to be proud of him. My husband, Theo, sat beside me in his navy suit, his hand resting on my knee under the table. And I remember leaning into him and whispering that I hoped my father would say something kind tonight, something that would make the drive worth it, something that would make me feel like I belonged to this family, the way my brother Preston always seemed to. Preston sat 2 seats down from my father, his wife beaming beside him, their 2 kids dressed in matching outfits, the picture-perfect family my father had always paraded around like a trophy. I told myself it didn't matter, that tonight wasn't about comparisons, that I was simply here to celebrate a milestone. Gerald cleared his throat and the room quieted, and he began with the usual retirement speech cliches, thanking his staff, thanking his clients, joking about how he wouldn't miss Monday morning traffic. Everyone laughed. Then his tone shifted, and he said the words that would replay in my mind for the rest of my life. He raised his glass higher and said, "Only the children who made me proud are truly mine." The room erupted into applause, glasses clinking, people nodding like he'd said something profound instead of something cruel. And I sat there frozen, my stomach twisting, because I already knew where this was going. My father's eyes swept across the room and landed directly on me, and the applause slowly died as people realized he wasn't finished. He looked at me in front of 200 people, in front of my husband, in front of colleagues I had grown up watching him respect, and he said, "You can leave," just like that. 3 words, delivered as casually as if he were dismissing a waiter. I felt my face go hot, my ears ringing, the room tilting slightly as every head turned toward me. Preston's wife covered her mouth. Someone near the back let out a nervous laugh, unsure if it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. My father's expression was flat, unbothered, like he'd simply stated a fact he'd been holding on to for years, finally free to say it out loud now, that he no longer needed to protect his image at the firm I used to work for before he pushed me out for not fitting the culture, a phrase I now understood meant not being Preston. I thought about the years I spent trying to earn his approval, the promotions I chased just to hear him say he was proud, the birthdays he missed, the graduation he skipped because of a client emergency, the wedding toast he gave that mentioned Theo's career achievements more than mine. All of it crystallized in that single moment. Standing in a ballroom full of strangers who now knew exactly where I ranked in my father's eyes, my hands were trembling as I gripped the edge of the table, and I began to stand, because what else was there to do? What else could I possibly say that wouldn't sound like begging for a love that was never going to come? I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me, some pitying, some smug, some just uncomfortable, and I thought this was it. This was the moment. I would quietly walk out of my father's life the same way he had spent years quietly walking out of mine emotionally, even when he was physically present. But then, just as I turned toward the exit, I heard the second chair scrape against the floor. Theo stood up beside me, buttoning his suit jacket with a calm, deliberate motion that felt louder than any words could have been. The room, which had been holding its breath waiting for my exit, suddenly shifted its attention to my husband. And I watched confusion ripple across my father's face because Theo wasn't supposed to be the one making a scene. My father had never taken Theo seriously, always treating him like a quiet accessory to my life rather than a man with his own history, his own influence, his own reasons for being invited to sit at that head table in the first place. Theo looked at my father with a composure that unsettled the entire room, and he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone with the same unhurried confidence he used in board meetings, and he said, loud enough for every table to hear, "Before my wife leaves, there's something everyone in this room deserves to know about tonight." My father's smile faltered for the first time all evening, and I felt Theo's hand find mine under the table one last time before he stepped forward into the center of the room, the entire ballroom now waiting silent to hear exactly what he had to say. Theo stood in the center of that ballroom, phone in hand, and every guest at every table leaned forward slightly, sensing that whatever came next would be the real reason they'd remember this retirement dinner for years. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to, because the silence in the room did the work for him. He looked at my father and said, "Gerald, you spent your speech tonight talking about legacy, about pride, about which of your children deserve to carry your name forward. I think it's only fair the room knows the truth about how that legacy was actually built these last 3 years." My father's jaw tightened, and I saw his hand grip the edge of the podium, his composure cracking for the first time in front of the people he'd spent his whole career trying to impress. Theo explained calmly and clearly that 18 months ago, Wheeler and Associates had been on the verge of losing its biggest client, a manufacturing group that made up nearly 40% of the firm's annual revenue. After Preston mishandled a compliance filing that nearly triggered a federal audit, I watched Preston's face drain of color as Theo continued, saying that the only reason the firm survived that quarter was because a private consulting group had quietly stepped in, restructured the account, smoothed things over with regulators, and rebuilt the client relationship from scratch without ever taking credit. That consulting group, Theo said, was run by him. He'd been working behind the scenes for a year and a half, protecting a firm that belonged to a man who had just told his own daughter to leave a room because she hadn't made him proud enough. Gasps rippled through the tables. My father opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out because there was nothing to say that wouldn't confirm exactly what Theo had just revealed. Theo turned slightly, addressing the room now instead of just my father, and said that he'd made a personal choice back when he first realized how deep the trouble ran, never to mention it, never to use it as leverage, because he respected me too much to turn my father's failures into a bargaining chip in our marriage. He said he only came forward tonight because he refused to sit quietly while a man he had spent a year and a half protecting stood in front of 200 people and humiliated the one person in that family who had never once asked for recognition. My father finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, insisting this wasn't the time or place. But Theo simply said that there had never been a right time or place for 30 years, so tonight would have to do. I watched Preston stand up abruptly, his wife tugging at his sleeve, his face somewhere between fury and panic as murmurs spread through the crowd, colleagues whispering to each other, exchanging glances that suggested this explained a few things they'd noticed over the past year, but never questioned out loud. A woman at a nearby table, someone I vaguely recognized as one of the firm's senior partners, stood up and said quietly, but firmly, that she wanted to know why the board had never been informed of an external consultant handling a crisis of that magnitude. And, just like that, the retirement dinner meant to celebrate my father's legacy became something else entirely. A room full of people quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about Wheeler and Associates and the man who ran it. My father looked at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief, as if he was only now seeing me clearly for the first time in years, not as the disappointing daughter he'd measured against Preston's carefully curated success, but as someone who had built a life, a marriage, and a partner strong enough to step into a room and dismantle 30 years of favoritism with nothing but the truth. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Theo reached back for my hand, and together we walked toward the exit. The same exit my father had pointed me toward minutes earlier, except this time I wasn't leaving in shame. I was leaving on my own terms, with my head high and my husband beside me, while the room buzzed with 100 conversations that no longer had anything to do with celebrating Gerald Wheeler's retirement. As we reached the doors, I glanced back one last time and saw my father still standing at that podium, alone in front of the crowd he'd spent his life performing for, finally understanding that the child who made him proud wasn't the one who inherited his name. It was the one who built something real without ever needing his approval to do it. Outside, the cool night air hit my face and I finally let myself breathe, and Theo pulled me close and told me he was sorry for springing it on me, but he couldn't watch my father humiliate me one more time without the truth finally coming out. I told him I wasn't upset. I was grateful, because for the first time in 29 years, someone had stood up for me exactly when it mattered most.